So good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Julie Watkins, and I will be hosting today's Travelogue brought to you by the Geographic Society of Chicago. Since 1898, the Geographic Society of Chicago has educated the public about geography and its important uses. Today's GSC trains students in the latest geospatial technology. Through services such as our community mapping projects, we offer unique educational experiences that harness the power of maps and the integrative tools of GIS, or Geographic Information Systems, to solve environmental and community issues. Together, our board and membership provide educational opportunities for students and educators, assist in building geographic materials collections in educational and cultural institutions, promote new and emerging technologies in problem solving, and much more. If you're familiar with our Travelogue series, you know that we normally conduct these presentations in person each month at the Chicago Cultural Center. So while we can't get together physically at the moment, we wanted to remain connected to our supporters and our members, so we've turned our Travelogue series into webinars. After this Travelogue, please make sure to share any feedback you have with us. With us to present today is Eugene Flynn. He is on the board at the Institute of Continued Learning in Schaumburg, and he and his wife have actually visited Europe 20 times in the past 18 years, so he's going to be a good guide for us today. Gene will be presenting on Paris in the late 1800s and early 1900s as the cultural, artistic, and architectural capital of the world. This presentation looks at life before and during this beautiful era, as well as the many landmarks and reminders from that era that exist today.
Okay, great. So again, I'm delighted to be back speaking to the Geographic Society. It's been fun to both being downtown when we had the sessions there, and certainly by Zoom. It has a lot of benefits as well. So today we're talking about Paris, and we're going to focus on Paris in its heyday, what they call the wonderful period, the beautiful period, or the Belle Époque. And the time period, it's very, very specific. It's 1871 to 1914. A lot of periods in history. There's issues about the start or the end date, but here it's very, very clear this time period. And you could guess why 1914 is the end, because of World War I. So that's not a spoiler alert. So just a little history of this presentation. It was, I put this together at the request of the Itasca Library, because they were having a process where everyone in the library was encouraged to read this book by Robin Olivier. It's called I Always Loved You, and it's the story of the French and American artists, Mary Cassatt, an American, and Edward Degas, and who was one of the early founders of the Impressionist movement. So it's a wonderful book. And the library asked me to prepare a presentation about Paris in this period. And they had another presenter that would actually talk about the artwork of this period. So that was kind of the source of this presentation. And what we're going to be doing today, we're going to look a little bit at the history of Paris. We're going to look at the renovation and what was taking place during this time period. And I think Julie and I were talking before the session, there's a very direct geographical implications of this presentation. And the issue is, why did, Paris at 1800 was largely populated by poor people. And but now Paris, in the central Paris, it's largely the upper class, it's the wealthy, and it's the people employed higher incomes, where the poor are out in the suburbs. The public housing is largely away from the central city. And so, so how did this happen? What was the change of social economic issues and class and status? How did this all boil over in Paris? And we're going to be exploring that. That's one of the direct implications of this that we'll be talking about. So first of all, I wanted to give a little history of Paris. And this is very high level. If we have any historians on board here today, I'm sure I'm missing a lot of issues but I wanted to give just some high-level points. So the first one is in the 1700s and 1800s, Paris was the center of the Enlightenment, where philosophers and rich people would meet regularly often over wonderful meals and wine, and talk about philosophy and talk about the rights of man, and how that the rights of man and the relationship between the people and the governed, those who govern them, particularly the king. And one of the direct messages that came out in the discussions is the king really is serving because he is doing good for the people. And if it's a bad king, and if the king is not meeting the needs of the people have a right to go in a different direction. Well, as you might guess, this was directly feeding into our American Revolution. And when Thomas Jefferson was writing the Declaration of Independence, he was taking the thoughts and the messages from Voltaire and Rousseau directly into that type of document. And indeed, the rights of man, when we think of Thomas Paine and all the American founding fathers, direct implication to our revolution and our separation from Great Britain. Well, so the French Revolution, another huge impact on Paris. This was the center of the French Revolution. And here we have a painting of the storming of the Bastille. After the French Revolution burnt out and Napoleon came to greater military success, and eventually Napoleon dissolved basically the democracy that had existed to create an emperor, that he became the Emperor of France. And here we have a painting by Jacques-Louis David, and this is Napoleon crowning himself emperor. And the fellow sitting in the middle is the Pope. And the Pope normally would crown a king or an emperor. That was a standard practice in Europe. Well, Napoleon, he diverted from that practice and said, I'm so important, I'm going to crown myself. And symbolically, I'm more important than the Pope. Once we had the battles of Waterloo and Napoleon being sent off to a remote island, at the Treaty of Vienna in 1815, the French monarchy was restored. So England and Germany, Prussia, those kings wanted France to go back to the traditional monarchy and put things back together. Well, as you would expect, things can't go back to the way they were. And between 1830 and 1848, Paris had 7 armed uprisings taking place. And that was a surprise to me that there were so many. So we know from the Victor Hugo's Les Miserables and the wonderful musical, we know about the uprising that actually was in the one that he was writing about was in 1830, and it was one of 7. And here we have a painting by Eugene Delacroix, and this is a painting in the Romantic style. And we'll be coming back later to talk about different styles of painting. Okay, so now, 1848, the king that had been established in 1815, he was running the end of his success. So there were major demonstrations. The army turned against the king, and he resigned. And the French people, centered in Paris, they created the Second Republic. And Louis Bonaparte, who was the nephew of Napoleon, was elected president. And here we have, so this is the Second Republic. The first one was at the French Revolution. And here we have a painting of the president of France. Well, he was president, but he was elected only for a 4-year term. And 3 years into his term, he decided he really liked all this power. So he dissolved parliament, really with the support of the army, and he declared himself an emperor as Napoleon III. So here we have the Second Empire coming into play. And during his time period, and this lasted till 1871, 20 years, plus a couple of years as president, there were major advances in education, industry, railroads started to come into practice, and in medicine. We have people like Louis Pasteur creating the marvels of improving health through science. So all of this was taking place under Louis Bonaparte. Now, one of the major things he did that we want to talk about today is the renovation of Paris. And this is one of his lasting accomplishments. And first of all, we have to understand the Paris in the early 1800s, it's not the Paris that we see today. It was very narrow streets. They were overcrowded, diseased, crime, unrest, 7 different uprisings. And so Paris was home to the poor in many respects. And I'm sure there were some rich people there, but much of Paris was if you had lots of money, you probably wanted to live on an estate outside the city. So here we have more streets, these early photographs, Rue Saint Nicholas, the Chardonnay. And this is right near what we'd consider, central Paris, near the Louvre and near the center of Paris today. Here we have another street. This is right near the Louvre. And this street here, Rue de Jarnay, was demolished to make way for Boulevard Saint-Germain, which is a very wonderful, one of the many wonderful boulevards in Paris. Now, the renovation of Paris was a 17-year effort. And this is the fellow that organized the effort. It was Baron Eugene Haussmann. And he was prefect of the Seine, which is like the Seine River. This was you would basically consider the Paris metro area. And as prefect, he reported to the king, or the emperor at this time, but this was his assignment. And he was not an engineer. He was a lawyer by training, but he was a very effective organizer to know how to get money to pay for this and to have the contracts to put this into effect. And so the plan that he devised, and this took 17 years to pull off, it involved the demolition, complete or partial demolition of 19,000 buildings in Paris, and the construction or renovation of 34,000 buildings. I mean, this is enormous effort. And so the old streets gave way to long, wide avenues. The buildings, the new ones built, or even the old ones that were remodeled with new facades so that it blended in. They kept rules that every building had to be 5 stories or less, so that you had a homogeneous architecture style throughout much of central Paris in a neoclassical style. And here we see from a bird's eye view, the boulevards and central Paris, everything emanating from the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. And this made this the most beautiful city in the world. It also, and I'm sure this was not lost on the emperor, it also made it much easier to defend, because in this narrow streets, it would be relatively easy for people to put up barricades if they were trying to overthrow the government. When you have wide boulevards, you could put a cannon at central locations and you can control every direction from the Arc de Triomphe. And so it gave the military and the emperor a much greater practical authority to execute militarily. Now, so here we have 1870. Paris is the most beautiful city in the world. It has leading in arts. It has culture, music. It has a beautiful opera house. It has just an incredibly beautiful city in a thriving country of France. And I think the emperor was quoted in 1870 saying, "We have peace and prosperity, and as far as we can see, we have peace and prosperity." Well, ladies and gentlemen, it did not last long, because unfortunately, their neighbor, the neighboring country, Prussia, and as we recall at this time, Germany was not a unified nation. Prussia was the powerhouse in the large nation to the north with a magnificent army, but Munich and Bavaria was a separate country. And we have Mad King Ludwig down in Bavaria as king and building his castles, but he was king of Bavaria. And we had 14 or 15 other kingdoms on what now is Germany. And so the Prime Minister Bismarck, Prime Minister to King Wilhelm I, he wanted to unify Germany, and he wanted to unify it under Prussian control. And so what is better to unify a country than a nice little war? And so Bismarck came up to a strategy that was very, very effective. So there was a diplomatic squabble at the time. And the squabble was the throne of Spain was open. And it appeared for a while that the nephew of King Wilhelm of Germany, his nephew would be appointed king of Spain. And that was very much a concern to the French, because they already had this potential enemy to the east, which was this new power of Germany. And then to have a German influence in Spain, that could put potential adversaries on both sides. So the French protested vigorously about this issue. And finally, the king of Wilhelm in Germany said, "Fine, we won't appoint my nephew." But Bismarck sent a telegram with this kind of message to the king of France, or the emperor of France, and he worded it in such a way that he knew the emperor in France would find this very insulting. And it was one of those situations where you and I could look at this telegram and say, well, it seems like a perfectly reasonable telegram, but Bismarck knew that the emperor in France had very thin skin and would find it insulting. And indeed he did. He fell right into the trap. So the king of France, Louis Napoleon, decided, we have to go to war with Prussia because they insulted me. And so you could not imagine a worse debacle for a war. In July, the French king declared war. They lose 4 battles very quickly. The French king or emperor is captured. Paris is under siege for 4 months. The only way to get information out of Paris is a hot air balloon. I mean, this is desperate situation in Paris. And so the French surrender. And they were going to lose Alsace-Lorraine. They had to give that part of France to Germany. They had to pay huge millions of billions of dollars in today's value to the German government to pay for the war that they lost. And you could ask, well, could it get any worse than this? Well, it can get worse, because during the siege of Paris, the French army was basically gone because they were off fighting and losing in remote battles. So Paris was under the control very quickly of the French, what we call the French Commune. And the members of this are called the communards. So these individuals were some of the same people that had been rioting 7 or 8 times in the previous 25 years. So they were actually in charge of Paris. And when the French government surrendered to the Germans, the individuals in Paris did not. They said, we're going to fight on, and we don't even want the king back. We're going to have Paris as an independent, self-ruled piece of self-ruled city. So this went on for 4 months. And finally, the French army came in and stormed Paris. In May of 1871, they stormed. Tens of thousands of people died, including many civilians, men, women, and children. The The exact number probably will never be known, but it was a very brutal, and they brought in troops from a different part of Paris, of France. They didn't have the French soldiers come in because they were part of the city. They brought in troops from remote parts of France. They came in and put down this insurrection. And the city itself laid in partial ruin after the Communard surrendered. So here we have City Hall or Hotel de Ville on the left. On the right is one of those one of those wonderful boulevards, Rue de Rivoli, which is right near the Louvre. So this is what Paris looked like. This most beautiful city in the world looked like in May of 1871. So here we have the beginning now of the recovery of Paris, the amazing recovery of Paris and France. And we call this the Belle Époque. So we're going to look at it in two different parts. The first one is 1871 to 1890, and then we'll look at 1890 to 1914. So the first big thing that occurred is a new form of government. So Louis Napoleon, he got out of, they ransomed him, but they did not bring him back to power. The French people said, we've had enough of this emperor, let's have back to a republic. And this is called the Third Republic, because we had the first one at the French Revolution. We had the second one in 1850, and here we have the Third Republic. And this lasted up until 1940, when, as you would imagine, the French surrendered to the Germans in World War II. So here we have a new government. We have Paris quickly repairing the physical damage. And here is a poster showing one of the celebrations of perhaps of the signing of the new Constitution. So here we have a great excitement in Paris. And it was a wonderful time to be young, and particularly to be young and rich, because there was so much happening in Paris. And we'll take a look at some of that. However, behind all the beauty, there was lots of social and cultural chasms. And some of these existed right into World War I, and even you could even say World War II. But the first chasm was supporters of traditional religious values and those that were supporters of science and enlightenment and ridiculed religious values, or were even anti-clerical. And this ties even back into Napoleon and separation of church and state. But there was a division here on religious values. There was also this middle one in red. There were supporters of the French army, and then those that were distrustful of the French army, which you could readily understand if the French army came in and resulted in the death of 10 or 20,000 of your fellow Parisians. You would certainly understand distrust of the French army. And lastly here, and these are only three of many different chasms, but the last one was there were supporters of return to the traditional monarchy. And they were often the supporters of the French army, and also often, the most supportive of religious values. And some of the left and right here often have a pretty high correlation. But on the other side is you had supporters of democracy, and you had even supporters of anarchy. Karl Marx and his writings, still held sway in parts of Europe. And as we saw, even in leading up to World War I, there were anarchists that felt we had to destroy all government to start from scratch. Now here's a couple, elements of the chasm. We have the wonderful building up on Mount Mar called Sacré-Cœur. And this was built in 1885, relatively quickly. And it was built as a thanking God for the sparing of Paris after the great encirclement of the German army. So this was, people made the promise that if we relieve and we live through this traumatic time, we're going to build a wonderful commemorative to Christ. So beautiful building. It's a wonderful building to visit, wonderful church, and it's a wonderful view. It's very popular to stand on that, and that the top of that wall, you get a wonderful view of Paris and the Eiffel Tower. But this was right down the block from the Moulin Rouge, which with the can-can and its other provocative entertainment, this was the embodiment of decadence. So here within 3 blocks of each other, we have a chasm of cultural values. But moving on from the chasm, let's look at some of the other beautiful things taking place. So here we have the Opera House, this amazing opera house built in 1875. The architect was Granier, and it's incredibly beautiful. Mary and I took a tour of the opera house. We were there. The opera was not, we couldn't get the opera was not in operating at the week we were there, but we did get a wonderful tour, and it's just incredibly beautiful building. They have a newer and much bigger opera house a little further in a slightly different part of Paris. But this shows the beauty and the attention to detail in a classical architectural model. We had the operas themselves. We have Bizet and the opera Carmen, which is performed regularly in the US. It's one of the most popular operas. And Hector Berlioz and the Trojan, another wonderful opera. We had music, great trends in music. Claude Debussy and Fauré, they took music from the Romantic style that had existed and brought it into a modern format of music. And Ravel, he is credited with creating music with of an impressionism flair, so that you could see the sun rising in the beauty of his music. So these were new trends, and I'm not even going to cover what was happening in medicine. Many wonderful things was happening in medicine, not only for the benefit of the French, but many Americans went over to Paris to study medicine at this time period because they were welcomed in Paris. Paris, they were the leader in creating specialized hospitals for women, for multiple conditions. They really created the trend of specialization in a very big way, and they welcomed Americans and people from around the world to come and study there. So, but let's take a moment to look at paintings, because in painting we have what the common trend at the time in the 1830s was the Romantic style. And here we have the picture we looked at earlier of Lady Liberty leading the rebellion of Paris to overthrow the government. And I mean, this is right out of Les Mis. You know, Les Mis puts this into play, even with the child running there to the right of Lady Liberty. So this was the prevalent style of Romantic, and what became the new style, it was not Impressionism. The new style was Realism. And here we have 2 examples of the realistic style. On the left, a painting from Monet, and on the right from Colbert. But so these were the style of realism that was the official and the most popular style. And the style was promulgated and supported and endorsed by the Society of Artists of France, or the SAF, and it was what was taught at the École of Beaux-Arts, which is the School of Fine Arts. So here people came for sculpture, architecture, painting, and were immersed in the approved style. And once a year, they had what was called the salon, where this art and the sculpture was all displayed. And here on the lower right, we have a picture of the salon from 1892. And there were 1,700 paintings and 1,000 sculptures on display. And this was a 3 or 4 week effort of people visiting. Tens of thousands of people would come and pay to see the art. And the art was lined up from the floor to the ceiling. They might have, we can see here on this painting, everything is just packed together because they wanted to show off 1,700 paintings plus the sculptures. Now in all of this time, the Impressionists had one painting that was accepted by the Salon. I mean, so what became the beautiful Impressionist style that we value so much today, it was really repudiated at the time. And here are some of the works of art. Just to look at Impressionism for a minute. Here was a painting that Claude Monet did. And these may be in painting, or they even could be in watercolor. But this was one of 2 works that he created on the same day. So on this day, on June 30th, this is one of 2 paintings that he did. And the style of the Impressionists were just ridiculed by the establishment and by the critics. And they called the painting, they said, these upstarts violate all the rules. They paint inappropriate subjects. They use the wrong colors and the techniques with little care for detail. And it's slapdash work. It's Impressionism. So the artwork was just totally ridiculed, and including the fact that they painted dancers, they painted things that were inappropriate by the views of the standards. Now, what was also taking place by 1890, and here we're looking at the second phase of the Beaux-Arts. Here we have the exhibition taking place that occurred every 2 or 3 years. So we have at the exposition, I'm going to go back 1 slide. So we had the Eiffel Tower created for the 1890 show. And this has a Chicago connection because our World's Fair was 3 years later. And our founding fathers and our, the powers to be, they realized we have to come up with something to equal the Eiffel Tower. And we were stuck. We couldn't figure out what that was until an engineer by the name of Ferris came up with the Ferris wheel. And it was belated. It really wasn't even available at the opening of our fair, but it did come in 3 or 4 months later and was a huge success. So this was the Eiffel Tower, and they were planning to take it down 5 or 10 years after their exhibition. But then they decided, well, this would be a wonderful radio tower. And that's what saved the Eiffel Tower that we can enjoy today. Now here we have, this is the gallery of machines from that 1889 exposition. And it was the largest covered building in the world at the time. And France, by this point, with even going back to the French Revolution, the idea of education for all, and that education wasn't just for the wealthy, that was ingrained in the French culture. And so and that continued to grow. So there were technical colleges and universities throughout France. And by this point, France had largely equaled Britain in terms of industrial production and maybe even exceeded the English. And certainly they had some of the more modern technology, as did Germany. But they just marvels, and they were very proud to show this off at the Gallery of Machines. But it goes much broader. Here is a picture of the Grand Amphitheater at the Sorbonne University. And this goes back to 1882. I mean, this is their auditorium. I mean, our auditoriums are really bland by comparison to this beautiful, beautiful architecture. Now, as we look more at the second part of the Belle Époque, one of the first things that comes into great play is the Impressionists. They really, from art, they really become very much accepted, and they become very stylish, in great demand, both in the French culture and even internationally. And there's a great Chicago connection to the Impressionist artists that I'll be talking about shortly. But here we just have some of the paintings. Here's one from Pizarro of one of the boulevards of Paris. And the beauty of this is you can walk down this same boulevard today and it will look, except instead of horse-drawn carriages, there will be automobiles, but you will see this exact thing today in Paris. And here we have a metro entrance to the metro, which metro opened up in 1900. So it's over 120 years in operation, and certainly it's expanded over time. But look at the beauty of this entryway. And this is Art Nouveau, like new art, but Paris moved beyond even Impressionism. They added Art Nouveau style to art and to architecture. And this is just a marvelous beauty. Now, the downside, because it's 120 years old, is there's no escalator or elevator for this particular stop. And that's true for much of Paris and true for London, for that matter. So if you're traveling here and if you have any mobility issues, you want to make sure you look at the subway map to know where are the stops that do have an elevator and an escalator, because many do not. And it would be difficult to add it, although eventually I'm sure they will. Another painting by Renaud on this is over the Seine River, and the beauty, it's there today for us to visit. Even the train stations. Here we have the train station Gare de Lyon, and this is the Train Bleu restaurant. And you can see, we know the French take food very seriously, but even their train station, they expect you to have the option for a great meal. You know, compare that to our Union Station and our North Ogilvy Station, and you can get fast food at ours. Here you can have a wonderful 4-star meal. The bridges, came into being in as part of the Belle Époque, just incredibly beautiful. Here is the Galeries Lafayette, which is a wonderful, huge department store, and it opened up in 1912. Mary and I were there, and we were there in March, and it was very crowded. So it was kind of shoulder to shoulder throughout each of the floors. We finally went up to the top floor where they have a wonderful cafeteria so that we could grab a coffee and a croissant and just relax for a few minutes before we got back into battle with the other shoppers. But incredible, just an incredible experience and a wonderful view of Paris. Now, talking a little more about art. So Claude Monet and his movement, the Impressionists, by 1890, they were very well established. And the aura of the salon and those were largely even dissipating towards the end of the 1800s. But here Claude was so successful, he bought a property about a 30-minute train ride out of Paris. To us it might be like an Arlington Heights, but it was still a rural type environment, and he was able to create an environment where he created the pond. He created this bridge so that he could use this as a subject for his works of art, and he was incredibly successful. There's Mary and I on the upper right, over on the bridge that exists today. We were actually there on April 1st, which is the first day that it's open. It closes, I think, in November 1st and doesn't open until April 1st. So we were able to be there early on that day, and the flowers were still clearly on their way to blooming, but it was still a wonderful place to visit. And his home is very nice to visit in the kitchen. So you can tour all of that. It's a wonderful day trip. Yeah, as we look, by 1914, Claude was a national hero. He had great works of art and works that were commissioned by the government to say, we want you to create a large footprint art, and that's probably not the right term, but here we have a building that's near the Louvre, and it's called the Orangerie. And this is a building that when the kings had Paris, they had their oranges growing here in the winter so that they either could be eating oranges in the winter or protect the plants until they could be moved outside. And so the French government created this into an art gallery for Claude Monet's works of art. And you see there Mary on the left, but you can see on the right the context of people sitting there, and this artwork surrounds the entire room. So you're looking at 15 or 20% of the room, and this entire room is surrounding his art is surrounding the entire room. Today in Paris, the Impressionist art is housed at the Musée d'Orsay. And Orsay was the Gare d'Orsay was a train station built in 1900. And you can see it on the left, very classical style. And after it was decommissioned as a train station, they eventually decided, let's convert it into to house the Impressionistic art. And it is actually the most visited art museum in Paris. So and it's an incredible amount of art with focusing on the Impressionistic style. And I'll just show one work of art, this ranco art of the of people out enjoying in a picnic environment or in a festive environment. So this goes back to 1876, but at the time he could not give this painting away. Nobody was buying it. Now it's worth millions of dollars. So how times change. Now I wanted to circle back a little bit to the early. Well, first of all, let me circle back to the dead. And one of the places Mary and I have actually visited twice is the Père Lachaise Cemetery. And Père Lachaise was a Jesuit priest who was the confessor to one of the kings. And so the Jesuits named their cemetery after him. And certainly the city government, they wanted to move all the cemeteries out of Paris proper. So they decided that this cemetery would become a cemetery as a resting place for celebrities and artists. And so we have wonderful Chopin is buried here, Proust, and if you were a huge celebrity in art or architecture or music, you had a chance to be buried here. And it's just wonderful sculptures that reflect the art and the skills of the people that are buried here. And James Morrison is buried here as one of the artists. You don't have to be French, but you have to be famous to be buried here. Now, to circle back to another part of the tragedy of Paris, when the French army came in to put down the rebellion in Paris from the Communards, some of the Communards moved further east, and they wound up hiding or captured or surrounded in the cemetery. And the picture on the right shows a commemorative, because here the French army, they surrounded these Communards, they lined 140 of them up against this wall and shot them. And so they're buried here, and below that is a plaque indicating this is where the Communards met their death. So, in this Père Lachaise Cemetery. Now, on the right, sometime, I think it was 1895, this was the unions of Paris and other individuals said, let's build another another commemorative display to honor the communards. And I'm not sure the dates here are not correct, because 1895 is likely to be the time. But it was very hard for me to find out who was the architect of this. And it was only when Mary and I were in Lyon a few years ago that we saw that this Albert Marteau-Tomon was the architect of this, the sculpture of this work. And from my understanding, when he was given this assignment, he was told, do not make it a religious sculpture, no religion. These people were not religious. They were, and they certainly were anti-church, because the church was affiliated with the kings so much. So he said, he was told, don't make it religious. But if you look below the entrance to the tomb, we see an angel sitting there with her arms outstretched. And some people think that might have been his way to sneak in a little, this is a cross, perhaps, of the angel on the cross, as did these communards die for the rest of us, that we might live. So maybe he did sneak in a little religious implication here. So that was the Père Lachaise Cemetery. Well worth visiting. We've been there twice. But on your first visit to Paris, you don't go to the cemetery typically. You go to the typical spots. But Paris is so wonderful. If you go back a second or third time, there's so much else to see. And this cemetery is one of the jewels of Paris. Now, here, 1914, World War I, it was tragic to France and England, but the lights of Europe really went out. And here we have pictures of the troops in Paris. On the right, we have the French soldiers marching by one of the, probably one of the buildings used for the expositions. So here we have the end of the Belle Époque. And it's hard for us as Americans to appreciate the tragedy of World War I to the French and the English. But when we visit a little town in France, or almost any town you can visit, then it might be a town that looks like it's 1,000 people or 2,000 people, and you walk into the church and you see 80 or 90 or 200 names listed on the wall of those that died for France in World War I. And you see 8 or 9 names with the same last name. And these must be fathers and sons or cousins, just enormous death occurring. And this is only causing the death, not those that are suffered lost arms or lungs were damaged by gas. It was a devastation for an entire generation. And we don't have, even with our Civil War, we've experienced nothing of the level of tragedy that World War I represented for France. Now, there is a significant Chicago connection to the Belle Époque, and I wanted to say a few words on that. So it's interesting because in 1890s or 1880, Chicago, we recovered from the fire. Chicago was growing by leaps and bounds, manufacturing. We were the kind of the industrial powerhouse of the nation, but certainly of the Midwest. And the city leaders decided we really need to have not just show our industrial might, we need to show our cultural capabilities and our potential. And this resulted in the World's Fair for Chicago in 1893. But it also resulted in the creation of the Art Institute of Chicago. And Michael Martin Ryerson, who was one of the richest men in Chicago, and indeed the Midwest, he was on the board of the Art Institute, the newly being formed Art Institute. And so he went off to Paris and he bought the first of 17 Monet paintings that he owned, as well as 5 paintings of Renoir. All of these are now in the Art Institute of Chicago. And we have Mrs. Potter Palmer. She bought 3 Monet haystacks and eventually owned 50 of his paintings by 1895. And the richness of this is really found in the Art Institute of Chicago. Interestingly, the rich people in New York City, when they went to Europe at this time, they were buying the artwork of the masters like Rembrandt. They weren't buying the Impressionist art, they were buying the Rembrandts, which are certainly wonderful works of art. But I wonder who advised our Chicago newly formed art and buyers what to buy, because they certainly got great advice for what they purchased. And here we have this is a photo of the Palmer House on Lakeshore Drive. And this information was covered in the Art Institute magazine from last spring. And here we have the Palmer House, and it's loaded with Impressionist art as well as other art. But if we had a magnifying glass, we'd see some of the paintings of Monet on that wall. So that is as the final slide. The beauty of what we've seen here in these pictures from the Belle Époque, the vast majority of these buildings are still there and are easy to visit. And Paris has a wonderful subway system that it's just a joy to enjoy, to travel on. And I've heard a statement that every citizen of Paris is within a 10-minute walk of a metro stop. And I believe that's true, probably or true for 98% of the Parisians, but it's just a wonderful system. And once you learn to navigate it, you can go anywhere very quickly. And that is smart to do, because even if you have a mile walk to go to a different part of Paris to see something, it's often worth it to hop on the metro and get there and then use your energy to just walk further around that new spot rather than walking a mile or two to get to the next area that you want to see. So the metro is 120 years old. It's still modern, and except for the lack of escalators, it's still just a wonderful, wonderful way to travel around Paris. So Julie, that ends the formal part, but would be happy to entertain questions or comments from attendees.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Gene. That was a fantastic presentation. And we do have quite a few.
Okay.
So if you would be able to unshare your screen.
I will stop. Okay.
So our first question is, how were they able to build and rebuild so quickly? What building methods were used?
That's a great question. I'm not sure, but they clearly. So there was a couple rebuildings. There was the rebuilding to the 17-year process, and then they had the rebuilding after the Franco-Prussian War. But I think it was highly organized, and but the building methods, they had very strict standards, and they took the time to build correctly, because these are the same buildings that we're in today. And if you watch the TV show like Emily in Paris, I mean, the buildings that she's in, those date back to the 1860s. I mean, in the US, if we're in a house that's 30 years old or 50 years old, many people consider it old. In France, it's not unusual to be in a 300 or 400-year-old building that's maintained well and built well with stone. And when Baron Haussmann, when they ran out of government money, he went to the landlords or the owners of buildings and said, I want you to pay a huge amount of money to create this boulevard system. And at the end of it, your building is going to be worth 2 or 3 times as much money, because the rich people will want to come and live here. So your rents can go much higher. but you have to pay the money up front for me to build the boulevard. So very ingenious way of paying for the reconstruction once they ran short of government money.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you. During the time of the Third Republic, were the political, scientific, and cultural chasms as bitter as those we are feeling now?
Either good question. There were lots of chasms, and it affected a lot of the success of France in the even after World War II. Many of these chasms still existed, so that that France was not a unified country in terms of preparing for World War II. There were still divisions. There was distrust of the army still. People looked at the way World War I was handled to say, the general should have done something very different. So France was not ready for World War II as they could have been, because of some of those chasms still existing. So we have chasms today, but they hopefully it doesn't affect us to the extent it affected France, even into World War I and World War II.
Mm-hmm. When did Impressionism begin to be honored as a true art form?
I think in the second half of the 1880s, it had reached awareness that this is really a legitimate art form. And by the 1890s, it was becoming popular, even if it was popular by the Chicagoans coming over there. Many of those French Impressionists, they hadn't sold a single painting before 1880. I mean, they had this wonderful artwork, but nobody bought it. So, but by the end of the 1880s and then into the 1890s, I think the awareness of the richness came into play.
Absolutely. And here's a question that you partially answered about how the boulevards were financed, but this question says, how were these magnificent buildings and bridges funded? Was it in the same way?
Yeah, yes. So the bridges, those were funded by the government. But the buildings, the boulevard, creating the boulevards, it started with largely government funding, but as you can imagine, the legislatures over time were saying, we're giving so much here. Housemen went to the building owners to get financing. Now, and we have to realize, France, much as London or Madrid, if you're the capital of the country, people from all over the country are paying money to support the capital. So, like in Chicago, we basically have to fund our own things. We don't get, the federal government doesn't come in and say, we're going to rebuild all of Chicago. But if you're the capital of a country, you often get lots of money because taxpayers around the whole country are kicking money in that gets spent. The government makes the decisions how to spend it. So they want their capital look extra nice.
Mm-hmm. In the Beaux Arts salons, were they open to all people? Was there a cost to enter at all?
Well, yeah, there was a modest cost to enter. So there was a cost to enter, and I'm sure everyone was welcome, but the working people, they were working during the week. I think those were, it was the culturally advanced people that wanted to come there. We didn't see it in the painting in that one picture, but I'm sure it was that it was a cultural phenomena to be there and to be seen in your best outfits. That where the exhibitions like their World's Fairs, those everyone was, that was much more rich and poor. Everybody was welcome there, and did come. But I think the salon for art, I think that was more the art appreciative class would come to that.
Mm-hmm. Did Van Gogh ever present in these exhibitions?
No, well, I don't think so. I think his work was discovered later, and again, in his lifetime, I don't think any of his paintings ever sold in his lifetime.
Wow. Wow.
How times change.
Yeah. We have another question here. It says, do you have any idea what the engraving on the Frédéric Chopin gravestone below his name refers to? It says something along the lines of Zelazawa.
No, I do not. But his body is there except his heart. His heart is in Warsaw at a church in Warsaw. And there was a by the way, there was a huge interaction between Poland, or the Polish people, because in the early 1800s, Poland did not exist. It had been, split between Germany and Russia, and so so those countries were trying to stamp out the Polish culture, where the French, they had many Polish artists would come to Paris and would be welcomed there. So there's a real link between Poland and Paris.
Very cool. Do you have anything to say about the writers or unusual sewers during this period?
Oh, the writers, or what was the last word?
Or the unusual sewers.
No, I do not. We've explored lots of Paris, but not the sewers.
Yep. Are artists still being buried at the Père Lachaise cemetery?
Absolutely, absolutely. In the French model, somebody has to pay to keep up your tomb and pay rent. So you might be buried there, and your family pays, for 20 years. If nobody pays on that 21st year, they remove the body and the tomb. And you see some, if all the family members died off, or if there wasn't a community of artists to support that person, that you see the tomb just collapsing in on itself, and pretty soon that'll just be removed and somebody else could be in that space.
Absolutely. What happened to the people that lived in Paris when the buildings were torn down? Where were they relocated?
I think, well, eventually they moved to the suburban areas. And today, the public housing is in the suburban areas. And for example, if you land at Charles de Gaulle Airport and you take the metro type train to downtown Paris, central Paris, you're passing these suburbs, areas like Saint Denis, which was a huge cathedral where the French kings were buried. Those are surrounded by tenements and by public housing, and largely people and their descendants, Muslims that came from Africa, from the French colonies in Africa. So the poor are out in the suburbs, and the immigrants are out in the suburbs, where central Paris is, that's the desired place to live for the middle class and higher population and wealthier population.
Mm-hmm. Two more questions and comments here. So this comment says, thank you. That was an exceptional presentation with wonderful photographs. And then our last question is, when will you be visiting Paris again?
Nothing scheduled. We hope to be back traveling. We had a trip last year planned to go to Copenhagen and take a cruise to the Western Norway, but we hope to be back in 2022. Absolutely. And Paris will be there when we're ready. And it's feel free. Oftentimes people think that you should go to Paris in the summer, and it's wonderful in the summer, but it can be very hot, particularly in August. But it's wonderful to visit Paris in March. There's lots of cultural things going on, and airfares are inexpensive. You can get package tours from Air France that include 7 days in Paris and airfare at a very attractive rate. And they're called the holiday packages from the airlines. So it's well worth considering.
Okay, thank you for that little insider peek. And thank you for answering all of these questions and for your fantastic presentation, Jean. We're lucky to have had you here today.
Well,
And that will conclude our travelogue for today.
great.
Thank you.
And
Thanks
thank you all for being here. And thank you, Julie.
Absolutely. Thank you all for attending, as Jean mentioned, and for supporting the work of the Geographic Society of Chicago. Our next travelogue will be later in April, and we'll have June Scott presenting on the Siberian Railroad. So for information on future travelogues or on how to become a member of the GSC, please visit our website at www.geographicsociety.org. And we hope to see you all again soon. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Jean.